Hi, hello, welcome to the Physionic podcast. My name is Nicholas Verhoeven. I'm a PhD candidate in molecular medicine. I hold my master's in exercise physiology. I've been involved in research for quite some time, and I have some nutrition science background in my undergraduate classes as well. And today we're going to be discussing the ketogenic diet. Yet again, I'm trying to really hammer home the keto because it seems to be a hot button topic for a lot of people. A lot of people are really curious about it. And covering one study just isn't sufficient to really understand keto and its effect on our health. Really specifically, that's what I've been focused on. So just two podcasts ago, I believe it was 2 weeks ago, I covered the ketogenic diet and its effect on cholesterol. Well, I'm going to be revisiting that exact topic. However, the population that's being studied is slightly different in this particular study that I'll be going over. So in the previous podcast, I discussed how the ketogenic diet affected people who consumed a ketogenic diet that was high in unsaturated fats and how it affected overweight individuals. And it seemed like it had some really positive effects in relation to the outcome of cholesterol. And that's really important. I always make sure that I point this out because people usually come in the comments section and start asking me, well, then is keto then good? Good is such a broad term. You have to define the outcome. What's the outcome that you're interested in? And then what's the condition that you're in? So for the previous podcast, the condition was for people who are overweight, eating a highly based unsaturated fat ketogenic diet led to quote-unquote good outcomes in that they reduced their cholesterol and increased their HDL cholesterol. And they also lost a ton of weight. So it was overall great outcomes across the board. Now, if you ask me that question, is it good for, blood sugar regulation? You could get different outcomes. Now, I will admit that study also had great outcomes for blood sugar levels. So it really depends on the outcome and the population or the sample that's being tested in these studies. And in this particular study that I'm going to be discussing today, we're going to be looking at how the ketogenic diet, and it shouldn't take too long, but how the ketogenic diet affects young individuals that are of a normal weight. So there's a distinction there in the population that we're interested in and the sample that we're testing. So the sample is young, healthy, normal weight individuals as opposed to overweight, middle-aged individuals. But the ketogenic diet is still being applied to both. However, there's still a slight difference in that as well, which I'll go into. But the study that we're going to be covering is called The Effect of Low Carbohydrate, High Fat Diet on LDL cholesterol and gene expression in normal weight young adults, a randomized control study. I'm only going to be covering half of the study because I thought the other half of the study was, poorly conducted, bad methods, methodological. That's a really tough word to say. I'm just going to shorten it again. Bad methods. So I don't feel like the data there was anything that we could glean any sort of information from, if it's good or bad. So I'm going to be foregoing that. However, I will be discussing how the ketogenic diet affects cholesterol, blood cholesterol, in individuals that are healthy, normal weight. So a brief introduction. The ketogenic diet is simply, if you're not familiar with it, which I'm sure most of you guys are, don't worry, I'm not going to go into too much detail here. Ketogenic diet is just a high-fat, low-carbohydrate diet. So you typically consume most of your calories from fat, then the second most abundant nutrient is protein, and then you have less than 5% carbohydrates typically. Ketogenic diet has been shown in other studies to be great as an anti-epileptic, so great against seizures, particular seizures, as well as for weight loss and other areas as well, including certain cancers. This is stuff that I'm just repeating from previous podcasts because it turns out to be true based on a series of different studies that have been, that have looked at those outcomes, looking at weight loss, looking at epilepsy, looking at cancer, things like that. So it turns out that it does seem to be beneficial for depending again on the context. So this study, however, the aim of this study is to find out how the ketogenic diet affects cholesterol in healthy normal weight individuals. I've said that like 3 times now, but that's just the point that I'm really trying to get across. So now let's go a bit into the study design, and then we're gonna go into the results, which are I'm gonna say counterintuitive to what most people, if you listen to the previous podcast, you might be scratching your head as to why the results are the way that they are in this podcast. But fear not, there are explanations or potential explanations. Anyway, study design. There are 39 people that were recruited, men and women. However, the study was very much slanted towards women. So about 80% of the participants were women. So I would say that the results that we end up getting from this study are likely more applicable to women. If they also apply to men, that's a strong possibility. However, because the people that were involved in the study were largely women, I would say that at least we can say that with a great level of confidence that the results of this study are more applicable. We have a data-driven reasoning for women, but we would have to retest this whole thing with a male population, or a male sample, I should say. So just want to throw that disclaimer out there, but it did technically include both. And then these individuals were, just one more time, were young and normal weight and had generally healthy biomarkers like blood glucose, cholesterol, et cetera, et cetera. Participants, however, were then split into 2 groups, as you can likely imagine. The control group, and they were told to just maintain their diet. Just keep doing what you're doing. Just stick to it. No other regulations. They didn't have to count calories, didn't have to do anything like that. Just keep eating what you're eating. Then the keto group was told to, switch from their regular diet to a ketogenic diet. And the keto group consumed an unrestricted keto diet, which is the exact same, which is really great, exact same as the previous study that I covered, where the keto diet was also unrestricted, meaning they didn't have to calorically count, they didn't have to restrict how much they consumed or anything like that. They just put them on a keto diet. So again, on an unrestricted keto diet containing less than 5% carbohydrates, which is similar to the previous study as well. Then both groups had their anthropometric measures, like their body weight, girth, things like that, and blood measurements to test their cholesterol in this situation, taken before the study began and then 3 weeks later. So the study length is 3 weeks, unlike the previous study that we covered, which was, I believe, 24 weeks, so quite a bit longer. It's not really a confounding variable, but it is something to potentially keep in mind. Like, could we see some of the results? Would the results stay if they had done it for 16 weeks or 24 weeks? Who knows? I would venture yes, but that's just pure speculation on my part. So the study was only 3 weeks. And if you're thinking maybe they didn't get into ketosis, let me go ahead and nullify that. They didn't test for ketosis. So let's just assume that these people were not in ketosis, just because we don't actually have any information on that. The previous study that I covered, again, 2 weeks ago, they also didn't check if these individuals were in ketosis because they didn't really care. They just wanted to know the diet, independent of ketosis. Or maybe dependent on ketosis. They just didn't care about ketosis. That's the point. So were these people in ketosis? We don't know. Okay, so the results. Now, I'm going to give you the results first, and then I'm going to give you an asterisk, or maybe more so a stipulation on those results. So if you're watching the podcast, I've got a ton of values up here. Hopefully you can kind of work through it. Again, just kind of go by the color coding that I've got there. Hopefully you're not colorblind, but I've got 3 different colors. Just follow those color codes. And then I've got instructions on how to read some of this stuff. If you're listening to the podcast, then fret not. I shall be going through everything. So let's go ahead and discuss cholesterol. Then I'm going to be discussing body weight, and then I'm going to be discussing the diet itself. Okay, so the first thing, cholesterol. Here is where things start to get wonky by comparison to the previous study. And this is where people might say, Well, science doesn't work because this study contradicts the other study. I don't know what to believe. That's lazy thinking. It's lazy thinking. You have to be able to look at all the different variables and figure out where the differences between the studies and what could account for the difference in result. So let's go ahead and do that. In cholesterol, the keto group experienced an increase in total cholesterol, which is definitely different from the previous study that I covered just 2 weeks ago. The keto group also experienced an increase in LDL cholesterol, so low density lipoprotein cholesterol, which is quote unquote considered good or bad cholesterol, bad cholesterol. So that is, and then they also looked at HDL, so high density lipoprotein, which is quote unquote considered good cholesterol, but there is some evidence saying that if it gets too high, then it can also be negative as well. But the point is that for HDL cholesterol, it increased. So the keto group saw an increase in HDL cholesterol, saw an increase in LDL cholesterol, and saw an increase in total cholesterol. Now, the keto group did, however, experience the greatest increase in non-HDL cholesterol, which is encompassing of LDL cholesterol. So while HDL cholesterol did increase a little bit, it didn't increase enough to account for the overall increase in cholesterol. The overall increase in cholesterol was far more accounted for by non-HDL cholesterol. So we're talking like VLDL, we're talking IDL, we're talking LDL. So all of those other subcategories of cholesterol make up non-HDL, as it says, anything that's not HDL cholesterol. And that's what ended up making up this total rise in cholesterol. Okay, so this is completely contradictory to the previous study. So the other thing that I wanted to point out, which is very much in line with the other study, is body weight. So body weight actually decreased for both groups. So not just for the keto group, but also for the control group, the group that was told to just maintain their diet. Something's wrong there. I'm not saying that the researchers are fudging the data. As a matter of fact, I think they're being completely honest, very honest. But if you have a control group, typically you don't want them to have a bunch of changes, because the idea is that they should be the exact same at baseline as they are 3 weeks later. So the fact that they saw decreases in body weight is not great. That's not exactly what you want from a control group. However, the keto group did also experience loss in body weight. However, the difference between the control group and the keto group in terms of the amount of weight lost there was no difference. So they lost roughly the same amount of weight, which wasn't a whole lot. It was like 1.5 kilograms or something like that. Nothing massive. But again, they were only at this for 3 weeks. So that makes some sense. Okay, so there's some oddities here. And again, I'm not saying that this is oddity in terms of collection. The researchers are doing anything funky. This is just the way that things panned out, and they are just reporting the data. And we can still glean a lot of information from this because of the way that things ended up working out. However, I want to throw in another variable here. I talked about cholesterol. I talked about body weight. Cholesterol increased with the keto group. Body weight decreased with the keto group. Diet composition. So how the keto diet ended up working out. Now keep in mind that these people weren't instructed like, hey, eat this and eat this. They were just said, get on a ketogenic diet. Here's generally what it is. Good luck. Do it. So once they ended up calculating like what they ate and whatnot, their diet composition was significantly different from the control group. Now, of course, some of that should be kind of like, duh, right? Because they're on a completely different diet. So, of course, the diet composition is going to be different, the different macronutrients. The protein was higher for the control group. The protein was higher for the keto group. The fat was much higher for the keto group, which, of course, makes sense because it's a high-fat diet. Then the carbohydrates were much, much lower for the keto group. Again, that makes complete sense. Dietary cholesterol was about 3 times higher, 4 times higher for the keto group. That, of course, makes sense. Now, where I'd like to draw your attention, however, is the breakdown of the total fat. So the total fat is made up of saturated fat, monounsaturated fat, and polyunsaturated fat. And interestingly enough, the saturated fat, all three of them were obviously higher in the keto group. However, the saturated fat was about almost three times higher in the keto group than it was for the control group. And you could say a similar thing maybe for the monounsaturated group as well, like 2.5 times higher for the keto group than it was for the control group. Now, how might this be a problem? Well, it's a problem by comparison. On its own, it's not a problem. It's just that's the way it is. But by comparison to the previous study, this is different because, as I mentioned, the previous study looked at unsaturated fat. So these people were on an unrestricted keto diet, which was the same for both groups. However, the previous study used a focus on unsaturated fat, so tried to decrease saturated fat intake. And this study, they consumed more saturated fats than they consumed any other fat. So there's a difference there in the ketogenic diet. If you want to call it the saturated fat diet, in this study is a dirty ketogenic diet, and the other one is a clean, I'm using quotations if you're listening, a clean version of the ketogenic diet. Feel free. However you want to stratify that, a saturated fat-based ketogenic diet and a unsaturated fat-based ketogenic diet. So there's a few things that are certainly a bit, I don't want to say alarming, but it's just data. It's just, if we look at this and we say that these people were completely healthy before they got on this diet, then they got on this diet and their cholesterol increased, even though they lost weight. They lost weight, which would mean that they would typically be in a caloric deficit and therefore are kind of pulling nutrients out of their bloodstream. And according to almost all the other studies that we've ever looked at, when you lose weight, you typically see betterment, decreases in your total cholesterol. If you have high cholesterol, but even if you don't have high cholesterol, you typically see a slight reduction in your total cholesterol. Not so in this situation with this ketogenic diet. Now, that could be, however, because of the high levels of saturated fat intake. So that may be a confounding factor, or for our interpretation, not for the real study itself. So in conclusion, and I should say one more thing actually. I know that the control group lost weight, and then how that can be a confounding factor is because the statistics are trying to find the difference between the keto group at baseline before they consumed their ketogenic diet. So you've got data point 1, and then 3 weeks later after being on a ketogenic diet. They look for the difference in these different outcomes. Let's say cholesterol. Cholesterol was at one point at the baseline, and then it increased up to another point at the ketogenic diet, after the ketogenic diet for 3 weeks. So that difference is what we're interested in. So an increase, let's say, of 5 points. Let's just say 5 points. Now the control group, what typically should happen is you should see no changes because they're not changing their diet. They're staying stable with their diet. However, for some reason, these people did not stick to their diet. They probably got in their own heads and started trying to diet or reduce their intake, or started being more meticulous about what they ate and stuff like that because there's some sort of researcher bias or something along those lines probably happened. So the idea, though, for the control group is that at baseline, they would get their measurements, right? Let's do cholesterol again. And then their cholesterol would be measured again at the end of the 3 weeks. And it shouldn't change. It should be statistically insignificant, the change between those 2 points. So then you run statistics again on those two, right? So the ketogenic diet saw a change and the control diet did not see a change. And therefore, those statistics will then tell you, okay, the ketogenic diet saw an increase in cholesterol, not only against itself at baseline, but also against the control group. difference. Okay, so what's problematic here is if the control group shows decreases or increases, essentially sees differences, then you have to check if the statistics comparing the keto group and the control group aren't because of differences in the control group. So if the control group suddenly drops their cholesterol and the keto group maybe stayed stable on their cholesterol, then the statistics might show, oh, there's a statistically significant difference between the control group and the keto group. But it's not because keto is bad for cholesterol. It's because the control group suddenly lost a ton of blood cholesterol. So you have to account for that stuff. And I did look at if you look at the statistics, however, that does not seem to be the case. I know it seems like I'm getting into the weeds here, but it's important for you to understand that in statistics, because they're running 3 sets of statistics. How many more times can I say the word statistics? It's getting in my head. But they're running stats on, hey, there you go. I'm shortening the word. They're running stats on the keto group, they're running stats on the control group, and then they're running stats on a comparison of both groups against one another. And that's why I color coded it on the video version of the podcast. So anyway, the point is that I looked at the statistics, and it does not seem that the control group changes in the control group are the reason or what are accounting for these statistically significant differences between the keto group and the control group. It is truly because there are differences, there are increases in cholesterol in the keto group alone that are creating these statistically significant differences between the two diets. We don't even need to compare it to the control diet necessarily. We could just look at the keto statistics and get that information. Okay. I know I just went off on a bit of a rant there, but let's do the conclusions and the takeaways, and then we'll wrap this up. So in healthy young women, I'm just going to go ahead and say this probably applies more to women. Do I personally believe this would also apply to men? Yes, I do. However, for the accuracy of the data that we have at hand, we will go with women primarily. And they did separate out the women equally across the 2 groups, control group and keto group. So, but it just so happened that only 20% of the sample was men. So the ketogenic diet for healthy young women, composed of mostly saturated fats, increases all forms of cholesterol, even in the face of weight loss. And boom, that's where I will leave things. And I will certainly be continuing to attack this kind of keto thing, just not attack keto itself, but to attack these questions about keto, to try to figure out, okay, in normal weight individuals, if they have normal cholesterol, like what effects are, how many studies show that there's a positive effect, a negative effect, et cetera, so we can get to kind of a consensus of, oh, this is what happens. And then take the same scenario, but just change one variable. Overweight individuals, cholesterol, what happens, and then look at diabetic individuals, and then look at those 3 categories, and then maybe look at just women, and then maybe just look at men. And that's what you have to do to get accurate data from studies. Studies themselves are just telling you about one particular snapshot of a population, and then you have to do more of those snapshots to get. It's kind of like a video. It's like the frames per second. Each study is a frame within a second, and then you have to continue to fill that to actually get a full video. I know that's kind of an obscure thing. Anyway, I'm talking. Let's just stop here. Thanks for stopping by. I always appreciate it, and I will catch you in the next one. Have a good one. See ya.